5 interesting things about quarantine or quarantines. 1. Origins of the word quarantine. The word quarantine is believed to originate in Old Venetian language and stem from the word quarantina, which stands for 40 days, or the period which ships were required to be isolated before passengers and crew could go ashore during the Black Death plague epidemic. It followed the Trentino, or 30-day isolation period, first imposed in 1377. Quarantine is distinct from medical isolation, in which those confirmed to be infected with a communicable disease are isolated from the healthy population. 2. Quarantine and religion. Quarantine is nothing new, and sacred texts have quarantine guidelines listed. In what could be the earliest mention of quarantine, the book of Leviticus from the Old Testament mentions, if the shiny spot on the skin is white, but does not appear to be more than skin deep and the hair in it has not turned white, the priest is to isolate the affected person for 7 days. On the 7th day the priest is to examine him, and if he sees that the sore isn't changed and has not spread in the skin, he is to isolate him for another 7 days. Similarly, the Islamic prophet Muhammad advised quarantine. Those with contagious diseases should be kept away from those who are healthy. 3. Famous people that were quarantined. Isaac Newton is probably the most famous person to ever be quarantined and turn a bad situation around, as during this time he invented calculus and discovered gravity. A firm believer in the fact that knowledge comes from observation rather than from reading books, Newton used this newly found free time for experiments and wrote papers that would later be published. William Shakespeare lived through many periods of plague in his life, and while it's difficult to prove as there is no historical data, many believe that he wrote King Lear while in quarantine. Giovanni Boccaccio may not be a name that quickly comes to mind, but he deserves recognition because he was producing work during the plague, the Black Death itself. This devastating outbreak struck Boccaccio's home of Florence in 1348 and killed his father and stepmother. It seems that this served as Boccaccio's inspiration, because in the years after the outbreak he produced his best known work, a novella called The Decameron. In it, 10 young people flee the 1348 Florence plague and spend 2 weeks in the countryside. Boccaccio even divided the novella by noting each day his characters spent in quarantine. Day 1, Day 2, etc., comparable to what a lot of people are doing now. 4. The Walking Dead. In the early years of the plague, Venice took the lead in establishing quarantine stations for maritime travelers. These stations were ships permanently at anchor, isolated islands, or segregated buildings. The stations became known as lazarettos, as those emerging had metaphorically risen from the dead, as the biblical Lazarus did, having been restored to life by one of Christ's miracles. The possessions of those who left the lazarettos were disinfected to prevent the risk of the infection spreading. Special kinds of apparatus were used to treat items like coins, letters and clothing. 5. The 50-year quarantine. During World War II, the British suspected they could use the deadly bacteria anthrax to cause devastation to German cities across multiple generations. Inhaled anthrax is almost always deadly, but the spore-producing bacteria causes more lasting damage by infecting livestock and soil. To test the theory, the British released anthrax onto Gruned Island, off the coast of Scotland. The test was such a success that 50 years later the island was still quarantined for being highly toxic to people. After extensive treatment with formaldehyde and seawater, officials declared the island safe in 1990.